listening to the Arsenal Therapy Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the 15-minute show, part of the Arsenal Therapy Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Adam Keys, and today we have a very special guest on the channel. We are joined by Dr. Raj, who has a great channel of his own, has a great Twitter account, and is actually knowledgeable and an expert on sports fitness, unlike many of the things that we read on Twitter. So Raj, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing well, mate. How about yourself?
Yeah, good. So I wanted to pick your brains on some of the stuff we're seeing about burnout and just get some expert analysis on this and talk about, I guess there's been so much talk around Saka and rest. There's been talk about Declan Rice and so on. But I've got a few things I want to share that we can talk through, a few graphics to aid our show. So first up, this is one that's been doing the rounds on Twitter a lot, the number of minutes played by Arsenal players. Obviously, this shows a massive disparity between kind of some of the squad players and our most used players. So if you look at the top, a lot of players, well over 3,000 minutes there. And that's something that has really alarmed a lot of people. But in your opinion, is this something to be kind of worried about? Or is this something that we should actually be praising Arsenal's medical staff for? Because it does show that there's a lot of players that have been fit and available for a lot of the season.
Yeah, see, I would lean, towards the latter, because when players aren't available, guess who gets blamed? And so, but when they are available, it's you're playing them too much, right? So I think it is a massive credit to the physio staff, to the medical staff, to the training staff, that players have been available for this long. And, a lot of times what I tend to see is that people conflate when players aren't doing well, they'll always say, "Oh, they're tired." Like, I'll give you Saka for an example, right? Oh, he's carrying something. We know that. Like, they've talked about the Achilles issue, the muscular issue. The question becomes, has it impacted his game, or is the fact that he's being doubled on the first touch on the wing that's impacting his game, right? So that's what I try to parse out. Just from minutes perspective, the team is going to have a lot of metrics on these players to understand when they might be in the danger zone and when they may not be. I do think there is some credence to the fact that, Mikel may not have full trust from some of the role players. And I think part of that is the fact that some of them have missed significant time due to injury, right? So if you're missing time due to injury and you're in a title race, you're in a Champions League tournament, how much do you trust them to be able to be put in those roles and win those games, especially in the league, for example? You're facing, a Man City who we know tend to, who have such a high standard. So I think it's a really difficult we're walking a tightrope of risk reward there, but the club is always going to have a lot more information on the players than we do. So it's really hard, in my opinion, to make a judgment on the outside looking in.
And how often do you think players generally go into the red zone? Because you're obviously someone that has huge knowledge across the board. You do a lot on basketball as well. And so you're seeing this from different angles to someone like me that just focuses on football. So how often do you think that the kind of infamous red zone is real? How much is in the reserve tank? And how much of a danger is true burnout to an elite athlete?
Yeah, I mean, it really it depends. It depends on so many factors because different players are going to have different fitness levels. Different players might be carrying different things. They're going to have different demands as well. The biggest things that we do see that can lead to some of the red zone is playing quite often, playing every third day for an extended period of time. And then also potentially when you're doing that, on the back end of the season. Yeah. That being said, there's not just fatigue, but it's also contextual fatigue. Like, as the season goes on, that players are not going to have the same metrics as they did at the start of the season, right? That's quite normal. And so you have to be able to contextualize that as well. It's not just an absolute number. It's a relative number to where you are into the season. where you are in terms of minutes. And more so than that, it's also just talking. I think a key thing we tend to miss out on is that players have relationships with the physio staff, with the training staff, with the coaching staff. And so ideally they're going to be very honest with you, but even if they're trying to not, they want to play, obviously, you're able to pick up certain things. You're saying, hey, maybe they're not moving the way that they normally are, right? And so that's another factor that comes into play at that point as well. But the reality is, in elite football at this point of the season, the top players are going to be playing a significant amount of minutes, and they're very likely, playing with some level of discomfort.
And how much do you think there's that level of rhythm as well? Because anyone that's played football or any sport knows that you can feel very fit whenever you go out onto the pitch for the first time and you haven't played for a while. One of the things you do is kind of inefficient running. You're not fully comfortable in your zone. You're not fully comfortable of your surroundings, your teammates, the build up, because you've been out of the team for a period of time. And when that happens, we quite often see a player overcompensate. And if you look at some of these minutes here, you look at the likes of Smith Rowe, 368 minutes, Fabio Vieira, 369. That's a very, very small number of minutes. You're talking kind of 4 games these players have played in total. How big of a risk is it at this point of the season that them coming into very high intensity games, having very little in their legs, to, without that much sharpness, of potentially them picking up injuries as opposed to the guys that we would think are close to the red zone? And that risk reward, there is, because of the lack of minutes in their leg, they could be at risk as much as the other players.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's two sides to it. It's not just burning someone out, but it's also pushing them too quickly into an intensity that they're not used to. I think in the case of Vieira and Smith Rowe, both. Vieira was almost unfortunate. Just as he was starting to earn that trust and that rhythm, right? He picked up he had a red card, then he picked up an injury, and so that and then by the time he came back, we were now into the business end of the season, where it's okay, do you want to reintegrate someone during this high intensity period? Same thing with, Emile Smith Rowe as well, right? And then he's also a player, in my opinion, that I think Mikel has a more longer view on with both these guys, knowing that you don't want to rush them back and potentially compromise them moving forward as well, right? And so there's that risk reward there too. And so, but then also what you said in terms of, the rhythm aspect. So yeah, when you do come back, right, like it's so sensitive at this level that you do lose that rhythm, and you might be overcompensating or, having to sprint back. Not just that, if you miss an assignment, now guess who the onus might be on, right? To make up for you on that team, right? Especially the way that Mikel uses his system, the press especially. It's very sensitive. Everyone has to be so coordinated. And so I think a lot of that is that rhythm, that trust factor as well. And so, yeah, I mean, all these things, come into play. Certainly, the minutes aspect, I just haven't seen. Maybe I've been missing it, but I just haven't seen enough research on minutes alone and having that correlate, right, with injuries. There's just so many more variables there. And so, like, for example, I think someone showed, what was it, 20 Liverpool's title winning side, and all their main guys played heavy minutes at that time. And so this might be something where, Mikel is trying to play these heavy minutes with these guys right now, but then his plan might be to rotate more as they go into the next phase, and he has players that he trusts.
Yeah, well, just on that point, so I've just brought up another graphic here, which is 6 of the Arsenal players have played more minutes than any Man City players. So Julian Alvarez has played the most minutes for City this season with 2,461. Ben White is above him with 2,566. And above him, we've got Saka, Ødegaard, Rice, and Saliba. One of the things with all of these players is they're players that are always available. They pick up very few injuries. They have done throughout their career. But what's interesting about this is Virgil van Dijk is also above any City player. He's played more minutes than Saka, White, and Gabriel. But when Liverpool won the title, as you've just said, a lot of their key players, they actually had 6 players who also played more minutes than any of Man City's players. So we saw that season that Klopp was able to keep a lot of players fit. The issue was Liverpool didn't reinvest after that. So a lot of those players did suffer burnout the next season. But when you compare this graphic and you look at the City players having significantly less minutes, how much of an impact do you think this is going to have in the last 5 games? Or do you think it's a case of we're at the business end of the season where there is that adrenaline factor, there's the mental side, and what you said about structures and positional play, if you've got your key players on the field that know each other's job and aren't stepping into a position that they're not used to and someone else isn't having to cover for them, having that rhythm, that familiarity, and that mental toughness and that steeliness that's created within a group, do you think that's more valuable, even with slightly tired legs, than having a big shake up in the team in the middle?
Back with Saliba and Gabriel as well. I mean, so there's some guys who are just kind of like irreplaceable right now, right? And I think that's reflected in the minutes that you see. So it's one of those things where you're trying to win every point. You know the guys are going to be a little tired, but then it's okay. You also, so like what, how do you balance that? And it becomes really, really challenging and really difficult in that regard, especially when some of your key players have missed the majority of the season. I think guys he trusted like Timber and Partey were massive injuries in that regard, and it's led to a knock-on effect. And so that's partly what has led to some of these issues. I don't think it's a coincidence that the team there's so many rumors about the team eyeing up, right, a central midfielder to help likely reduce the responsibility of an Ødegaard and some of his minutes, right? And so it's just one of those things where, yeah, I mean, the quality, the depth, I don't think is quite there yet to still replace some of these guys and have the same effect that Mikel wants, especially on the business end of the season. And so I think the depth piece comes in earlier in the season where maybe you can not have them play as much and then have them have less minutes like City has been able to do, or have got, like, for example, I think Bernardo Silva played 120 minutes, or he's played massive amount of minutes in recent games. He's a guy that's irreplaceable, but he hadn't played as many minutes early on in the season. So, but City as well are in a different part of their build compared to Arsenal, right? So,
absolutely, it definitely has an impact. Pep's been building that team for 8 years. A lot of these players understand the rotation side as well, which that in itself is something that it's not just the manager understanding rotation; it's being able to keep players happy. But interestingly, Mikel has come out and said basically that he had to kind of say to them, he had to stop them in training when he was asked about the burnout, but he said winning gives everyone a big energy boost. And that is something that's true at any level. When you're being beat, your legs feel heavy, you feel tired. When you're winning, you feel like you could play all day. And that's the same if you're playing football in the park or you're playing at elite level. We see how big of a lift a goal gives people. But I wanted to circle back on Thomas Partey before we finish, because he's one that a lot of people have been very eager to see him back, and people have said he's been back for 50 days. He should be able to play for Arsenal. But one of the things that I don't think a lot of people think about is match sharpness versus being fit. As someone who is a medical expert and works specifically within sports medicine, what is the difference between, aside from what we see with our eyes, but the medical side of match fitness versus just being fit on the training ground, for example?
Yeah, it's a big difference. I mean, you cannot replicate in-game demands physically or mentally without playing in games, and needing some minutes. And the longer you're out, the longer that process takes. I'll give you an example. Like Martinelli missed 2.5 weeks with his foot injury, had played a good amount of the season, and he's still being reintegrated back in, right? Like he played HD and then was out. So that tells you how sensitive it is. I'll give you another example. This is a basketball example. There's a player on the Lakers. He missed. He said that if you miss 1 to 2 games, you're now not match fit anymore. So now extend that. This is how sensitive these levels are, right? And so at the elite levels, they're extremely, extremely sensitive. And so there's a big difference between, healthy and being ready for games, right? So like for all these reports, like these reports about Timber coming back in February, we're all kind of ludicrous to me the whole time, because he always needed a significant amount of games. Like he's playing U21s today, but it just shows you how sensitive the levels are if you're doing it responsibly. And I think something I've actually found a positive with Mikel is that he's being really, not just Mikel, but I think the entire Arsenal staff, that they're being a lot more patient with some of these guys coming back rather than forcing them in right away. We all remember what happened to Partey when he came back, right? NLD, re-injured himself. That hasn't been the case. Like we have some of the pieces where we don't have to force players in immediately, right? The next phase becomes now do you have the quality depth where you can rest some of these players and not have a big drop off? So, everything to me is going to be, it's incremental and phased in. You don't build a squad that can just, rotate seamlessly without many, many years, especially considering where Arsenal started their rebuild, which was pretty much a full teardown, right? It takes a significant amount of time. So, I understand, I certainly understand the concern about fitness, but at the same time, you're also trying to win games.
Absolutely. And that's what managers are judged on. And when you see players like Zinchenko come in that have missed large chunks during the season, been in and out, one of the big things I noticed about Zinchenko was Arsenal's build-up has been very settled in that 2-3-5 throughout the season. And I did a breakdown show on him a few weeks ago. And what I noticed is our left back always inverts. When Zinchenko inverts, he takes up the 6th position. Yep. So that means our 6 suddenly has to take a different space in the team. And all those things change where players run, the movements, the repeatability within the game isn't as kind of seamless as it once was. Gabriel is suddenly covering a huge amount of ground compared to what he's covering with a Kiwior or a Tomiyasu. And again, all these things come into consideration. And it's the same with Thomas Partey being out. So now that he's back, hopefully we start to see him moving a bit freer. We start to see him really kicking into action again and see him bounce back strong for Arsenal. But look, thank you to Raj for joining the show. I think his Wi-Fi may have frozen. He is in California, and I really appreciate you giving us the time. You can find Raj on Twitter at 3CB Performance, where he gives regular updates on sports medicine and some great insight into football and basketball. So please give him a follow, and you can improve your knowledge of sports medicine very fast. Thank you to everyone that's joined. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you've enjoyed the show, and we will see you again very soon. Thank you.